Hi, everyone. Hi, App Innovators. So excited to be here. So welcome to Computational Action. We're going to talk about how your apps that you're creating for the Appathon can make real impact in the lives of people in your community, in your own lives, make real impact in the world. And we're going to talk about this in the framework of something called computational action. So you're going to learn all about it. Now, I hope that this is going to be really helpful for you as you're going through the Appathon, because we're going to go through some specific ways that you can make sure that the app you're creating for the Appathon has real impact in the world. And so I'm excited to get into this with you. I'm Nicole. I'm a master's student at MIT with MIT CSAIL, the Computer Science and AI Laboratory, and MIT Media Lab. And I did my undergrad at MIT in computer science. And after that, I was a product manager at Tumblr and then TensorFlow and Google. And while at these companies as a product manager, I was in charge of doing exactly what we just said. I was in charge of making sure the products that we were building have real impact in the world. And part of that means really understanding user issues and making sure that the products we were building were addressing real user problems. So some of the things that I launched addressed real user problems. So we launched TensorFlow certification for people who wanted to learn TensorFlow and be certified. They knew TensorFlow and could do machine learning engineering. I launched Tumblr for user safety while browsing Tumblr. Tumblr is a social media site. And as a product person, I'm really passionate about good product, good design. My passion is on helping make sure products that I'm creating have real impact in the world. And I'm really excited today to teach you all about how to do that and impart some of my learnings, as well as some of the things that the other people have taught me on how to make sure that the apps and the products we're creating do have that social impact. So to start, what is computational action? What does it mean? Well, there are two big points about computational action that I'd love for you to take away. One is called computational. Now, all this means is really that you're designing and creating your own solutions. And all of this work is very authentic to what real engineers, real designers, real innovators in industry and in companies are doing every day. So you're really doing the work of a real engineer, designer, innovator. And all of this work you're doing is actually very relevant to a future career if you're pursuing that type of career in industry. The other aspect is digital empowerment. So you're working on something you're really passionate about personally. You really care about this problem, and your work is actually making impact in the lives of those around you, in the lives of people in your community and people in the world. And you should feel empowered that you know the skills and tools to pursue engineering opportunities in the future, and also to create these solutions for real problems in the world. So these are two main components of computational action. We're going to be learning all about that this next hour. And I'm going to go through specific ways that you can do this computational action process in order to both achieve computational identity, basically be a real engineer, be a real designer, an innovator, an engineer, and also feel digital empowerment, feel empowered that you can create solutions for real problems in the world. Here's a sneak peek of the computational action process. You can see it's a cyclical process, and this is very important because this is how real engineers and product people and designers in industry think about this process also. As I was launching products in companies, we also went through this same process of starting with problems, doing user research, then designing and testing with users, or designing and prototyping. Then as we're implementing, making sure we had our task management on top and we were on top of our teamwork. And then launching and landing. So when the product was ready to launch, and not just putting it out there in the world and not doing something else about it, but seeing how it was being received. And then going back and starting the cycle again, because you have new data, you have new information, and you can improve the product or create something else based on the new data that you were getting. We're going to start with problem finding. We're going to go through all 5 of these steps in the next hour. So first, a fun little activity. I want you to picture a toothbrush. Now, if you have a pen and paper handy, go ahead and draw that toothbrush out just very quickly. Take 30 seconds or take a minute. What's really important here is try to think very detail oriented. If you're picturing it in your head, try to have it clearly in your mind what the toothbrush looks like. All right, got it? So take a moment, draw or picture that toothbrush. And now when you come back, I want you to ask yourself these questions. Did your toothbrush look something like this? Maybe it had, simple plastic handle, simple wooden handle. Or did it look like this? Did it have a bend maybe to the handle, a better curve for, holding? Maybe it had a softer grip, so it was like squishier, more comfortable to hold. The bristles also maybe look different. Maybe the bristles were curved, right, to better fit the shape of your teeth. Or did it look like this? Maybe you drew an electric toothbrush. Now, you can see there's a lot of different kinds of toothbrushes, and you might not even have been aware that there could be so many differences of a toothbrush, because we all kind of know, basically what a toothbrush looks like. It has a brush head and it has a long handle, right? Even in these different types of toothbrushes that you see on the screen, you can see that's still true. Like each of these, even though they could be very different, still have almost the same sort of design. Now, why is that? What is the problem here? What is the problem that toothbrushes address? Who are the people affected by toothbrushes? Well, we can sort of think, right? Even though toothbrushes come in all shapes and sizes, you saw low-tech ones, you saw high-tech ones, the problem is pretty clear. We know that the reason why toothbrushes are a thing is because the problem is we need to keep our teeth and gums clean. And this is all people are affected by this. And toothbrushes came out as a solution. Now, the reason why I started with this is because we can think about all sorts of solutions. You're going to have a ton of awesome, brilliant ideas because you're doing this appathon and you're a clever person and you're, a brilliant thinker and you have lots of ideas. But starting with a solution, or in other words, starting by creating a toothbrush, is not the way that this works. In order to make product that has real impact in the world, we always start with the problem and we always start with the user. And that is so important. That's why this is the first part of the computational action process. So the really important questions to ask are, what are the problems in my community? And then you can take that and start, thinking about ideas, start thinking about design, start thinking about solutions, and create, quote unquote, the toothbrush as the solution. But it's really key and really critical to be clear about the problem you're addressing. There's a frame of thinking called design thinking, and I really love design thinking because it really focuses in on starting with the problem. You can see the first steps for design thinking is empathizing and understanding the problem. What does it mean to empathize? It really means putting yourself into someone else's shoes. So even though, like I just mentioned, you have awesome ideas, you have, brilliant ideas that you want to put forth and start making an app for, it's really important to take a step back and really empathize with the user, because you might not necessarily be the user of your app. The real users of your app, they have problems and they have real issues that you want to address. So it's always so important to come back to defining the problem. And how do we define the problem? By understanding the people and understanding what they're having issues with. I'm going to go through some key steps of how we're going to do this. And we're then going to go to examples so you can also see an example of how we think about defining a problem. One of the most important things to remember is try to follow the computational action process. It will help you decide on a problem and then figure out what you should build, and then build it, and then test it, and then launch a product that actually addresses a real world issue. We're going to go through all of this in the next hour. So this is a sneak preview again. But one of the key things to remember is that you can repeat any of the steps at any time, especially the problem defining step, what we're going to talk about right now. This is because if you ever feel like you're stuck, if you ever feel like you don't know what you're working on, you can always come back to the questions that we're going to ask right now, which is who is affected, what is their problem, where it currently exists, and what is needed. Like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? So I'm going to go through an example. I'm really passionate about well-being. I really think the area of mental health and mental well-being is really important. I really care about this area. And I chose a topic which is well-being for young people. So well-being for roughly, under the age of 25. So I'm going to ask a question, right? What are the top issues in this area? So it's really important in the first phase of problem defining. I really like to start out by listing out what I know and trying to do a lot of research so that I'm not going into the user research blind. I'm not going to the user research without having done research of my own. So I did some research in this area, and I also, I'm thinking about it myself. Some of the issues still include stigma around mental illness and getting help for mental illness. Even without the stigma, there's also challenges to getting access to different tools, not just therapy, but different tools and resources for improving well-being or maintaining well-being for a young person. In general, young people are, those are in school or maybe teenagers don't have as much information as an older person might in the area of well-being and mental health. This is an area that's constantly shifting, especially very relevant today to, the 2020 pandemic and our current 2021, still post-pandemic world. This is being talked about more and more, and still, though, it seems like there's not as much information around this area being made available to young people. And another thing is a lot of these tools for well-being, they are often specialized for slightly older age, for more adult ages. But young people, especially teenagers, they're different age. They have different needs. And it's really important to think about what does the user need, not, not applicable to everyone. Someone who's aged 15 have different needs for well-being than someone who's aged 35. Even though even though the subject might be the same for well-being. So when we think about who's affected, we already talked about this. It's all young people under 25. When you're thinking about the problem, I highly also recommend you think about ways to scope your problem that you're solving for a specific scope of people or users. So you're not solving for the whole world, right? But maybe you're solving for a certain age group. Maybe you're solving for people with a certain, disability or maybe a health issue. Maybe you're solving for pet owners. Maybe you're solving for parents or kids. Something scoped so that you can actually find your target audience and get feedback on your product. Next, I think about, okay, what exists today in this area? What's good or bad and what's missing? And it's really fun here to think outside the box. Now, remember, you're at the first stage of computational action. You're in the problem defining stage. So it is absolutely great here to have crazy ideas, to think outside the box, to really brainstorm, and we'll talk about brainstorming in just a moment, because this is where you set out all of your current thoughts, your current ideas on the subject that you're interested in, and then you can take that and make it really useful in the next step, which is actually getting feedback and getting real data from users. So when I think outside the box, come up with a few things, and this is just an example, by the way, of course. So please try to take from this, how you might apply this type of thinking to your own problem that you want to work on. So one thing that really comes up, immediately is the thinking about therapy apps or other apps that are improving mood. Now these apps, they tend to suggest activities or ask for what your mood is today or right now, but there's some limitations, right? It's not as interactive and it's just an app. So, it might not be super effective. And also, For an app, especially, the drop-off rate might be really high. So, a person might use an app today or tomorrow, but, really stop using an app after 2 or 3 days, or maybe after a week. Thinking outside the box, why are fitness trackers relevant? Well, physical well-being is a key component for well-being, and sleep is massive for feeling good and good mental health. And a lot of fitness trackers are really interesting, give people a lot of data. But is there a downside to that? First of all, fitness trackers are not free, so they are more cost prohibitive, especially for younger people. And second, give a lot of data, right? They don't actually recommend an activity or recommend how to have better sleep, right? So that is a current downside. That's kind of missing the recommendation side of taking this data. Finally, again, thinking outside the box, fun apps and games definitely can improve well-being. Right? So YouTube and TikTok are very popular among young people, and they're really fun. They're very engaging. But of course, we're kind of all aware there's also the flip side of that. It could be very harmful too for well-being and mental health. So is there a way to think about fun apps or fun video game type, or fun video-based social media app type products that are for improving mental health and improving well-being? And that's a possible area that's possibly something that's missing that can be worked on. So this is an example of how to brainstorm around this theme of mental health and well-being for young people. And I highly suggest you think about sticky note brainstorming for this section, which is the problem defining section. Now, remember earlier we talked about you have so many ideas right now, and I don't want you to lose any of those ideas. It's important to fall out of love with your ideas because you want to empathize, right? Remember our design thinking cycle that we just saw. You want to put yourself into users' shoes and never assume that you know what users are feeling, but instead listen to their feedback. However, I think it's really awesome to start out by listing and brainstorming either individually or with your team if you're working with a team for the Appathon, because you don't want to lose your ideas. You don't want to lose that innovation, that spark that you have, that passion for the problem that you want to solve. I just want to give you a tool to take this and build a good foundation on which to move to the next step of computational action in order to actually make an impactful product. So how we're going to do this is I highly recommend you, if you're doing this virtually, to use Jamboard. If you're able to do this in person, either by yourself with a sticky notes and whiteboard, or with a team, that's even better. But Jamboard does a really good job of approximating what it would be like in person. So the idea is you take a set amount of time, and without speaking to anyone, individually, make a sticky note for any idea you have. Doesn't matter how small or big or how crazy, right? Thinking outside of the box, remember, is a plus here. It's good to think outside the box. Write down your idea and make sure you have a new sticky note for each new idea and just put it onto the whiteboard. Now, after a while, especially if you're working with teammates, you all put your ideas onto the whiteboard. And then you come together and you go through and you look at the ideas. Now, there are going to be some natural themes in your Post-it notes. So for instance, I chose earlier the topic of mental well-being and mental health for young people. So if that was my theme, I might have some different ideas for apps, or different ideas for fitness trackers, or different ideas for therapy tools, et cetera, and I'll put all of those ideas on sticky notes. My teammate might also have come up with some similar ideas, and it'll be really clear that some sticky notes belong in the same group. So you should end up with a few different groups of sticky notes, and those are your groups of ideas, and then you're gonna have your ideas in each section. This is a great way to start and get the juices flowing and really start understanding the problem. Now we're gonna jump right immediately from this brainstorming, after you have laid this foundation out of all your ideas, into the next step of computational action, which is getting to know your users through user research. Before we do that, make sure you take some time, pause the video, take the time and do this activity. You can use Jamboard, which is a free Google tool, to do it virtually, and get your ideas out and then organize them and see the themes that come up. So you know where you stand, and you know that you put all your awesome ideas down on paper. Now we can start getting the feedback from users, getting the data from users, and seeing if any of these ideas make sense with what the users are telling you. All right, so section 2 of computational action, user research, getting to know your users. Why do we do user research? Well, let's start with a story. So Henry Ford famously invented the first car, the Ford Model T. And supposedly, when he was asked why he made the car and why did he ask people about what they wanted, famously, he is thought to have said, if I asked people for what they wanted, they would have just said faster horses. I think this is a pretty funny example and actually very key to why we do user research, and also the other side of user research, like what it's not for. Because we're designers, innovators, engineers, right? So it's up to us to think about the new ideas. Understanding what users want is very important because you need to understand their needs. You need to understand what they don't have, what is missing. But you can't just listen to exactly what they say, because like Henry Ford, you'll just be only thinking about faster horses, right? We take user research, we summarize, what users are telling us they need, and then as innovators, and inventors and engineers, we make the first car, the Model T, instead of faster horses. So today we're going to talk about user research also, right? So I'm going to go walk you through how to do user interviews, some sample questions that you can ask, and also how to ask them in a very cost-effective and fast way so you can get the data quickly. First, how to interview. Think back about what I just said earlier about design thinking and starting with empathy. Curiosity, understanding, and being empathetic is so important in user research. And the reason why this is so important is because you don't necessarily know what your users, right? You want to try to step into their shoes, something like an exercise called Day in the Life, which is understanding your user's journey through the problem during a day. And you can also think about their needs as both functional needs and emotional needs. So go back to the toothbrush example, right? The functional need of a toothbrush is to get the teeth and gums clean. But some emotional needs are being pretty, the toothbrush being nice to hold, to turn in your hand. The toothbrush may be looking good in the bathroom, or being able to stand up by itself, or having a place to sit the toothbrush when you're not using it. So being really curious and being really empathetic is so important for user research, because you're going to be asking people questions, and being curious and empathetic is the only way to get a lot of information from the questions that you'll be asking people. So some of the things to remember is also to ask open-ended questions. Yes or no questions are generally not as helpful because they're not going to give you as much information. This is especially true if you're not going to be conducting any interviews in person. I know it might be very hard and you don't have a lot of time to schedule interviews to do either virtually or in person. So you can definitely do interviews and do, surveys, send out surveys via email, or to, social media lists, for example. But this is where the questions are going to be really important. You want to get a lot of information out of the questions. It's okay to ask questions that seem very straightforward or very basic, because remember, being empathetic means not assuming you know what the user needs or what the user's experience is. So try to err on the side of not assuming, and instead asking all of the basic questions so that you can really get the details of what the user's experiencing. So I will go through an example with the mental well-being app in order for this to sort of more solidify for you. But you can also see a list here of good questions to ask. And I highly suggest when you're making your user interview questions to refer back to this slide here in this list and see if any of these questions make sense for your product. Because what you can do is take this question and just add a little bit more detail to it so that it's relevant to the problem you're working on, and then put that into a Google form and send that out to users. Speaking of Google Forms, I do think that it is a very easy and quick way to send out questions to users and get responses back. So you can, like I just mentioned, create your list of questions, put in a Google form, send it out either to mailing lists or on social media. You can also send it out to friends, but remember, friends or family or those who know you, their responses might be a little bit biased just because they know you. So keep that in mind if you interview friends or family or people who know you. If you are able to set up virtual or in-person interviews, that would be awesome. Absolutely, that's a bonus if you can. You don't actually have to interview that many people because, in fact, a 5 will give you a lot of information. And usually in user interviews, when it's done in companies, more than 9 interviews don't actually give you a lot more information. It's just the same repeated things. So you can actually get a lot of info out of users from just doing 3 or 5 user interviews. Okay, so here's an example of the questions I asked for my topic, which is well-being, mental health and for young people, especially during the pandemic. So I started with a pretty broad general discovery question, which is just in general, can you tell me your experience with well-being in your daily life? And then can you describe that weekly? Like, does something change weekly? Do you do something weekly that you don't do daily? And what do you tend to do? Can you describe to me the activities you tend to do for physical and mental health? After this, I dug in a little bit deeper to try to understand the problem better. So I asked, what issues, if any, have you encountered while trying to improve or keep up good well-being or good mental health? And then I wanted to dig in a little bit more about what they know and their opinions as users. So I asked, what do you know about well-being and physical and mental health in general? And is there anything that you wish you could know more about? Or is there any experience that you wish you could have that you find difficult right now? So these questions all came from the list from the slide earlier. I highly recommend you go back to that slide of the list of sample questions and see what questions are relevant for your product. In fact, it would be pretty good idea to get a Google form if you're able to. Write down the list of relevant questions, choose from the list of sample questions that I gave you in the previous slide, and then send the Google form as a user survey to whoever might be a possible user of your product. And you can understand more about what you should build based on their feedback. So it's important to understand, of course, just with the Henry Ford example, right? Ask people and understand their problems, but then we'll synthesize or we'll summarize the data that we get, and then we'll start building. So the next section is from idea to prototype to testing, or in other words, designing with users and prototyping and testing on users. So we're going to talk a lot about ethical design and prototyping. What do I mean by ethical design? Well, we're going to introduce you to the concept of the ethical matrix, which is all about stakeholders. Stakeholders are people affected by the product. They're not just the users, although users are usually one stakeholder. You can also think, as an engineer or, as an innovator or someone who's making the app, I'm also invested in the product. I'm also affected by the product. I'm also a stakeholder too. We're going to go back to the mental well-being example. And in this case, I'm going to take the example of I've decided based on the user research and the problem brainstorming to create an app for mental well-being that suggests physical activities for young people to do every day. So I'm going to make a stakeholder or an ethical matrix of stakeholders, and this is going to help me figure out how to start designing, and I'll show you why that's the case. So first of all, I'm going to list 3 stakeholders. So one stakeholder is going to be the young person or the user of my product. But because they're a young person, another stakeholder is going to be their parent. And third, as I mentioned, I'm going to add the developer or the team building the product as a stakeholder. These aren't the only stakeholders of this product. These are the stakeholders that from my research and from the data that I've gotten, I think are 3 key stakeholders for this product. And it's really important to think about their values as I'm designing the product. You want to choose stakeholders for your product that are most important stakeholders for your product. I'm going to go to the values next. So privacy and safety of the app is as a top value. Engagement, the app being fun is going to be another top value. And then because the app is going to, be trying to improve well-being and suggest physical activities, the effectiveness of the app in improving well-being is another value. We have the stakeholders now, and we have the values now, and now it's time to fill out the matrix. And the way we're going to fill out the matrix is based on the user research we did, and based on all the information surrounding this that we have, we're going to, for each intersection in the table, does this value matter for the stakeholder? So for instance, the young person who is the user of the app being fun and engaging and the app actually working and improving their well-being are super important to the young person. From the research I did, privacy and safety, while important, were not as big needs for the young person. So I chose personally not to put that X there. When you do this for your app, you might decide based on your research, yeah, it matters to the young person. Feel free to add that X in. For the parent, based on the research, privacy and safety was definitely #1 value for this stakeholder. And the app being effective was also pretty important. The app being super fun or super engaging, while being important, was not of high value to this stakeholder. And finally, as a developer, I just interviewed myself and my teammate. And because we're on the team making this app, actually all of these values are super important to us. And so I went ahead and put out those X's for each value in the table. So this helps me understand what is most important to the most important stakeholders in my product. And this is really helpful because I want to keep all of these people in mind as I'm designing what I'm going to be building. So you can try it out. Make sure to pick at least 3 top stakeholders and 3 values for the product that you're thinking of building. And then remember to base the decisions you make based on the user research that you just conducted and based on the data that you have. After doing the ethical matrix, we're going to go ahead and talk about how to design and how to test with stakeholders. Now, first, we're going to talk about what it means to have low fidelity versus high fidelity designs. What do I mean by low fidelity? Low fidelity just means faster, simpler, quicker, usually lower quality. In the case of prototyping, we're talking about sketches. So even though we're building an Android app here, we're going to start with a sketch instead of building the app itself. Wireframes are another version that's kind of in the middle between low and high fidelity. And you can see there's placeholders for images, right? Because it doesn't matter. I understand it's an image or it's a video. I don't need to draw the whole thing out. On the other hand, high fidelity looks almost exactly like what it will eventually look like in the app. So when you go into App Inventor, for instance, in the tools, you can drag and drop in buttons and all sorts of components of the app. Those are high fidelity because those are exactly what it looks like in the app. Why do we start with low fidelity? Well, it's simple. It's KISS, or in other words, keep it simple. So we keep it simple by starting small because it's really easy to sketch, right? And at first designing, you don't want to jump straight into designing the high quality, high detailed designs because you might lose out on the key meaning of what you're giving to users. When you start making the app, I highly recommend you start with sketches because it will help you maintain focus on what you're building for the user. Because you're sketching it out by hand, you can draw out the most important parts of the app, and you won't be distracted by like really detailed, really nice aspects of the app that you might get distracted by if you start high fidelity. So I also recommend you think about the 80-20 rule, which in other words is thinking about 80% of the use cases. 80% of the use cases cover most of the use cases. There's always going to be the outliers, but those aren't the most important instances. You want to make sure the most important use cases, the most common user journeys through your app are sketched out and tested and are what you're focused on building. Testing with team members is going to be really easy, or maybe testing with friends if you don't have team members, because you're just going to be giving them the sketches that you have. Try to sketch one screen per paper, and then watch how people interact with your sketches. There are different ways you can do interactions. You could keep it really simple by pieces of paper, or you can put paper on top of each other as they click on different parts of the app, so it kind of simulates the real app. You don't have to spend a lot of time on this. Again, the reason why we said KISS or keep it simple is to try to save you time. So you're sketching it quickly, you're getting feedback from users or from your teammates on, does this make sense? Or do these buttons here make sense? Does this interaction make sense? And then you can move on to actually designing your app. The next phase, if you're interested, and I highly recommend you do this if you find you have the time, is wireframing. There are a lot of different tools for wireframing. I'm going to show you a few different ways you can do it, and feel free to refer back to the slides in order to go through and go to these websites and wireframe. But really, the cool thing about wireframing is that it'll give you the look of the app, and you can really test out the app as if it was real. So it's a bit higher quality, and it's also really helpful for you as the developer, the engineer, the designer, to see it kind of come alive, and you can play around with it and make your changes as needed. So all of these tools are available online. They're all free, although a lot of them have free trials, so be sure to watch out for that. So Marvel app is a really cool tool for wireframing, especially if you're creating an Android app, which for App Inventor you are. You'll go to the website, you'll create a free account, and make sure when given the option, you choose design in Marvel. There'll be a couple of different options given to you, but design in Marvel will take you to the wireframing tool. Once you get to the wireframing tool, absolutely play around, check out all the components that they have. What's really cool about Marvel is that the components are really easy to drag and drop. You choose what app you're working on. So again, for App Inventor, you're working with Android. And then you can see that there's going to be all sorts of buttons, drop downs, chat icons, like any interaction basically that you might want to build for an Android app, they probably will have it. And this is a great tool for future projects too. So if you're maybe building an iPad app in the future or a website in the future, this is still a great tool to wireframe because it gives you all the preloaded components. Balsamiq is a very similar website and tool, just a different product. So Balsamiq also gives you a free trial. You'll have the free trial for a month. And after you sign up, similar with Marvel, you can invite people to work on it with you. And then again, similar to Marvel, you'll choose what app you're working on. Maybe it's Android, maybe it's iOS, if for future projects. And then you can start filling it out with different screens, whatever buttons and whatever components you're looking for. So I highly recommend you check out Marvel or Balsamiq. Different experiences, they do the same thing. They're really fun to play around with. So I highly recommend you wireframe your main app screens and try out these tools. Now, you're in the appathon right now. You don't have a ton of time. So another thing that you can do is to just use the App Inventor for wireframing. And in App Inventor, as you'll drag in buttons, you'll drag in components, and it'll be real. It'll be basically coded. But because there's not that much time in Appathon, you can combine these two steps by combining both the prototyping wireframe part with the design in order to see if the design makes sense to you, but save yourself some time. I highly recommend for future projects that you check out Marvel apps, check out Balsamiq, because they're really powerful wireframing tools for any future hackathons that you do, personal projects, websites you want to build. It's always such a good idea to wireframe because it's that type of low fidelity sketching or low fidelity wireframing that can really help you get a sense for if your app or your product makes sense or not. But for the Appathon, it's totally okay to start wireframing inside App Inventor, because App Inventor gives you such awesome components that you can drag and drop and play around with. So I definitely suggest you try it out. Like I said, first start with sketches. This is really important. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it. You can absolutely just spend basically 5 to 20 minutes on the sketches, test it with your teammates or your friends, make sure the sketches make sense to you guys. You can go and start wireframing or designing either in one of these apps or inside Appathon itself. If you have time, testing screens with family members or friends or users would be a great idea. In industry, we tend to create a lot of wireframes and test that out with real users. And then we come back with our data that we learned, and then we make higher fidelity designs, and then we test that out again, also with real users. But of course, with Appathon, you're not going to have that much time. So it's totally okay if you do some light testing and then go ahead with your implementation. But I just wanted to give you these tools also for the future when you're working on other projects, so that you have these wireframing ideas down and also the tools in order to do the testing. Okay, so part 4 of computational action is really fun because we're going to talk about management and organization. So management organization is really important. It might not be super obvious at first, but it can get really messy really quickly especially if you're working with a team. Everyone has different assignments. You want to know what is happening with each assignment, if people are behind, if your team members need help. And you want to know this not just if you're the team lead, right? If you're the team lead, you absolutely should know. But as just a team member in general, it's really important to know the progress of the task going on, especially in such a short time frame like the Appathon, going to be in 2 weeks. So let's talk about organization. A very simple way of organizing it is what you see here on the left. It's called a Gantt chart. And basically you have the things to do on the left-hand side in a spreadsheet. And on the top, you have the timeline. And this is a nice way to start making a project timeline, because for your project, you might have these tasks like planning, research, design, implementation, follow-up, which is very similar to what we've just discussed. And for Appathon, of course, you're going to have a time frame of 2 weeks. But for, in industry and companies, we have timeframes of months or years or quarters. And this is a way to really plan out your project. But you can do this even for 2 weeks, because you can have for each day a column, and each day say, we are doing planning on these days, we're doing research on these days, and how many days implementation is going to take up in order to be finished by the end of your Appathon, which is, of course, a strict deadline. I'm also going to tell you about some key tools that you can also use for Appathon, but absolutely that you will probably hear about in the future as you work on more projects, or maybe if you work in industry, have internships in industry, etc. Most people, most engineers, managers, most people working in use these task management tools, which you might have heard of these names before. Jira and Confluence are really popular. Trello is also really popular, so is Asana. Before we dive into Trello, which I'll give you an example about, I'm just going to give you some tips and tricks, which is, so for most projects, actually, Trello is not a bad tool to use. It's actually pretty popular. And that's why I'm going to give you an example with Trello specifically. I highly recommend you look into it. You don't necessarily have to use Trello. To be honest, the idea of task management is really key. So what I just described to you as the Gantt chart, you can absolutely set that up inside a spreadsheet if you'd like, or even in a Google Doc. Now, the advantage of using something like Trello is that it also gives you some other tools so that you can easily see everyone else's progress. You can drag and drop to update the tasks, which is just easier and it's just helpful as you start managing a lot of projects. For scheduling, a good tip and trick if you're working with a team is to use a scheduler instead of back and forth, chains of messages. So When to Meet is a popular online tool for easy scheduling. Basically, everyone highlights when they're available. There's also other tools like Doodle and Calendly that you can look into. But is an easy tool. I highly suggest you look into it. And for documentation, especially if you're, writing something like a business pitch, or basically designing your architecture. This is again for maybe future projects with teams. Google Drive is actually really powerful. You can do a lot with docs and sheets and inside Google Drive. I highly recommend it for documentations. It's a good way of organizing so that you can easily share everything with your team. Okay, so let's look at an example with Trello. So for Trello, again, you'll sign up for an account and invite teammates. If you're making the account, if you're the first one to make the account, invite teammates to your workspace. And then you can start adding a workspace. So make sure there's sometimes a business trial. You don't need that for the Appathon at all. You want to get to the point where you're adding a board to your workspace. This is where it's really cool. You can use templates that Trello already has. Now, Trello will have something called the Canvas board, and that's a very helpful board because it has all the components that you need to task manage well. So you can see here, there's a backlog, there's a design, there's to do, there's doing, there's code review, there's blocked, there's testing, and there's done. I added the block section myself. That's really important. I highly add a category called blocked. And the way to do this is you make a card for each task that you need to do or that your team needs to do. And there's an assignee to that card. So you know who is doing that task. And then the assignee is able to drag and drop the card into any of these buckets. So maybe something is backlog, which means it hasn't been started yet. Maybe something is in design phase. Maybe something is in doing phase and the person is already working on it. The blocked category is super important because it lets you tell your teammates if you're unable to do something, if you're blocked for reason on some task, and you can update them immediately inside the Trello without needing to message back and forth. Same thing for you looking at all of the tasks that your team has done, where everything is. Blocked is a really important one because that is not right. You don't need all of these categories. You probably don't need code review. That's again for the future. You don't need it for Appathon. Code review is when you review each other's, make sure that it looks right and you can improve it. But this is really good to know for future, especially if you're going to be doing more engineering projects in the future. Trello is used by many companies, and even if they don't use Trello, if they use Jira or Asana, it's the same idea. So this is a good lesson to learn, a good process to learn. So I suggest you follow the steps in the previous slides to try out signing up for Trello or one of the other tools, and then make a board. Make sure you list out each task that everyone is doing, because by listing out each task, you can update the board asynchronously In other words, you can update the board whenever works for you. And then whenever anyone on your team looks at the board, it will always be updated to show what's current, what's being worked on, what's not being worked on. It's just a really easy way to communicate with your team. This can get really helpful, especially for longer term projects, but I hope it can also be really helpful for the Appathon as you're working on it. All right, finally, the last part of computational action, launching, landing, and what's next. So this part, you're almost at the end. You're maybe done with coding your app. You're thinking about putting it out into the App Store. But I'm here to remind you, it's not just about the launch. It's not just about putting the app into your App Store. This is where we want to talk about what does success look like for your app. So why is it important to talk about this? Well, let's go through a few terms first. So these are terms that you will definitely hear in companies and in industry. And these are absolutely terms that each tech company or company in general have, because they're all about success metrics. So KPI means key performance indicator, and these are the success metrics. In other words, the KPI is if it indicates whether your app is successful. Most companies also have what's called a North Star KPI, which is the most important KPI. So think about this in terms of toothbrushes, right? What makes a toothbrush successful? Well, one could be, is it keeping your teeth clean? The other could be, is it keeping your gums clean? Another could be, is it nice to hold? Another could be, is it being sold a lot, right? There are all these different possible success metrics, possible KPIs. But what is the North Star KPI? What is the most important thing to measure for toothbrushes? Maybe it's, is it clean well, right? Maybe it's, is it being sold? Are a lot of toothbrushes being sold? It kind of will be different company to company or product to product, which is why it's so important to discuss what the KPIs for your product and your app will be. Here are some common KPIs that generally people talk about when we talk about apps. And you can kind of think about it as a funnel. And this is a funnel that you will absolutely see basically in every app or in every company or tech company especially, because it's the same type of funnel. So it starts out with attraction or user acquisition. It goes down to, are users engaged? Are users using the app? It goes down to retention and satisfaction. Are users satisfied with the app? And then finally, if your app is supposed to be making money, it might have a revenue component at the end of the funnel. Another thing to think about for metrics and KPIs and why we care about this is that we are going to be gathering data because you're going to be launching an app, right? So it's important to understand how users are going to be using your app because they give you information. But the KPI is about the success of the app. So it's not just the gathering of the data. The KPI is really, in other words, if you think about, I'm making this app to solve this problem. How do I know whether or not it's successful? That is going to be what your KPI is. Your metrics are going to be things like how many people are using it and how often are they using it every day. These are the things that you will be measuring. But it's important to talk about the KPI with your team because you really want to be thinking about the future of the app, right? And this is something that in every company, in every real product, people are always thinking about KPIs and if the feature that they're launching are addressing the KPI, or in other words, if they're moving the success metric that they've set for themselves. So let's go through an example. So earlier at the very beginning, we talked about different therapy apps for mental health and well-being. One of the examples was Mood Ring. So Mood Ring was actually developed using App Inventor, which is really awesome. So it's, this whole app was an App Inventor team, and they, developed this really awesome way to track how people are feeling in the moment. You can also see it gives you a report. So you can see, when you were feeling at what time, and then how often you were feeling a certain mood. So this is the basics of the app. And we're going to think about, okay, what are the KPIs for mood ring? Well, I want to go through some of the common KPIs that we just talked about. And this is to give you an example of thinking about success metrics for your app. So engagement, daily active users. Mood ring, the point of mood ring is to check in on how you're feeling every day or multiple times a day. So daily engagement is pretty important. Now, feature usage is another part of engagement. So you can see in the text box, there's an option for users to enter in why they're feeling this way, but they don't have to write a lot or they don't have to enter it at all. These are different features of the app, and you can often see different usages for different features. So this could be a possible really important engagement metric. CSAT means customer satisfaction, and CSAT is a measure of value of the app, right? So we can understand if a customer is satisfied with an app by understanding if it's being valuable for them, if they're, if it's really addressing their needs. When we talk about churn, what we mean is leaving. So retention means if someone has stayed on the app. And this is also another important metric because it's measuring something different than all the other ones, right? Retention looks at time series data. So if someone uses the app one day, but doesn't use the app the second day, then you've lost that user on the second day. If someone uses the app one day, not the second day, maybe returns the third day, not the fourth day, maybe returns the seventh day, you can have this data about a user, understand if they've kept on using the app, maybe not daily, but they kept on coming back to the app after a certain number of days. And oftentimes in companies will use the next day return, which means the second day return, also a 7-day return, or in other words, looking at a weekly return rate, and also a monthly return rate or roughly 28-day return rate. So these are some KPIs that I came up with for mood ring, some possible success metrics for this app. And also I just want to remind you that the success metrics for your app, while they're important, they shouldn't be too many of them because you can kind of think about it as this is what makes the app work. So you might have different things that you want people to do in your app, but what is the app actually addressing? Go back to the problem defining section that we just talked about. App actually for top goal, that should help you in defining the success metric and defining the KPI. So as an activity, either for yourself or if you're working with a team, please think about the success metric, or in other words, the KPI for your app. This is really helpful because as you launch your app into the world and you see how other people interact with it, this will help you have a gauge on whether or not your app did what you set out for it to do, right? At the beginning, we were defining a problem, getting user feedback, and then figuring out what we should build in order to address that problem. So a KPI will help you be able to figure out how to measure whether or not your app actually addressed that problem. Some on landing the launch. And again, remember, landing means not just putting your app out there into the world and never caring about it again, but understanding how it's doing and what to do next. So launching plus landing is what we like to call, launch plus land goes to long-term success. And why is that? Well, because landing makes sure that validating whether or not your app was successful, right? Whether or not you set out, you created a solution that addressed the problem you originally set out to address. And landing often includes user research again, because user data is really important. Now, user research and user data can come in the form of interviews. It can also come in the form of tracking through logs. If you've heard of Google Analytics and Firebase, it's really easy to add Google Analytics and Firebase to an app. This might be a little beyond what you might do for the appathon, but I just wanted to let you know because these are great tools that will give you a lot of data. Everything in the funnel that we discussed earlier, Google Analytics and Firebase will automatically measure track all of that for you. But of course, you have to do a little bit of tweaking in order for that to be integrated into your app. So this might be a future project after the appathon if you're interested. Landing also means making plans for the next version of your app. Usually when we make something at first, we're making the MVP, or the minimal viable product, the core thing that you're launching to address the solution. Maybe there were a lot of nice to haves that you wanted to create, or your users gave you data that they really would love to have, but you just didn't have the time. You didn't it wasn't prioritized for good reason. In the future, in future iterations where you do this process again, that's oftentimes what landing also includes making future versions that might include these other nice to haves. Now on the launching side, something I haven't talked about as much yet is talking about communications and a press release. You probably don't need this for the appathon, but I want to let you know about it because it's really helpful to have all of this, especially if you're planning on making the app that you're creating with App Inventor and planning on doing more with it. And what we mean by PR and comms is really that we're distilling exactly what we created in a very understandable, clear way for anyone to be able to read it. It's actually very helpful to make sure that your communications around your app is very clear and to put some time into that, because you put all this time into implementing it and into creating an awesome product. You want to make sure that you're telling it in the right way so that people understand what it is and they will be excited and interested in using it. So finally, the activity for launching and landing is really talking about this comms and press release that I just mentioned. It helps if you think about this as an actual quote unquote real press release. Of course, maybe you won't use it, but it's really helpful as an exercise for you or your team to write out exactly what you've built and exactly what problem it's solving and why it's in solving that problem. And that will help you in communicating your app, and it'll help other people who don't know about your app and understanding what it is. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have time to look into Google Analytics and Firebase in order to hook it up to your app to set logging and start tracking metrics, that's always a great idea. But that's absolutely a bonus if you want to take your app to the next level and get more data on it. So just as a reminder to everyone, that is basically the computational action process. We talked about a lot in the last hour. We talked about problem finding. We talked about brainstorming. We talked about interviewing users and sending user surveys out to people, asking the right questions. Then we talked about taking that data, making an ethical matrix, and then designing prototypes, testing quickly with sketches and then moving on to wireframes and testing that and seeing if that made sense as designs for your product. Then we talked about how to manage tasks on a team, especially have a team of many people and everyone updates their card using a tool like Trello. And then finally, we talked just now about launching and landing your app and setting success metrics so that you know what it is you're measuring for the success of your app and planning for the next phase. Maybe a future app version 2, or maybe a follow-up, or maybe just testing, validating the app again with real users and getting data from them. And I want to remind you, as we talked about at the beginning of this hour, that understanding, empathizing with users is really so key to computational action. And of course, as you can see again and again, everything is cyclical and everything kind of comes back to what is the problem I'm solving for? Like what is, the actual issue I'm addressing? If at any time you are stuck and you're not sure if you should, make one decision or the other, maybe add this button or add that button, or make this type of interaction in your app, it's always helpful. You can always go back to the problem phase. You can always go back to understanding or asking yourself, is this what users want? Is this what came out of the user research that would be helpful for users? Is this the actual, is this helping address the problem that I'm trying to address here? So in conclusion, thank you so much for listening to this computational action 101, computational action process. I really hope that it's helpful for you when you're thinking about what app you're building for the appathon and how to make sure that it makes impact in the world and it's actually helpful for for people in your community or in your own lives too. And if you have any questions at any time, of course, feel free to reach out. But really good luck, best of luck on the appathon. I really hope this was helpful. And just remember, the process is cyclical, and so you can always come back to any part of the process if you ever get stuck in any section. Thank you so much, and best of luck on your appathon.